I'm going to pose the one question right now, and I don't expect a response, but we'll just let it soak in, because one of the things that always hits me at this conference is how we have citizens up here that are talking about very specific things, and then we have regulators up here that are talking about very high-level things, and I don't ever quite know how to get those to mesh. But one of the things we hear over and over again, especially on this issue, is that, you know, FERC is about to certify a new pipeline, and they say, well, the operator said it will meet all the minimum federal standards, which PHMSA oversees. And then we have smart people like Robert who say, no, it doesn't. And we have whistleblowers that were mentioned earlier that say, no, it doesn't. And there never seems to be a way to get to that level of, okay, FERC says they say it does, prove differently, and they don't have the expertise to deal with pipeline safety, and PHMSA seems to not have the resource base. So that's going to be my question, and we probably only have time for that one after at the end of how do we connect these dots at some point. So next up is Catherine Little, who's an attorney with Hunton and Williams, and she works a lot within the pipeline realm, and she is going to talk a little bit about FERC's authority as soon as I can find it. And there it is. Catherine.
Thanks very much, everybody, and happy to be here and hope to provide a little additional perspective. I think a couple comments before going through the slides a little bit, and one is just on the notion of perspective. As Carl said, I am an attorney with Hunton and Williams, and I'm part of the Hunton and Williams Pipeline Practice Group, which is a group that represents oil and gas pipelines, and we have for nearly 25 years, mostly on pipeline safety, regulatory compliance issues, and environmental issues, including construction. And you know, really our goal has been, and we hope our clients agree, to resolve problems, not to prolong problems. And with that approach that we look at these types of issues. And we know both, really on both sides of the ledger, it may be hard to believe from the public side of the ledger, but it is a challenging process for both an applicant and for the public. It is a daunting process to go through an application for a certificate of public necessity. It is a huge effort to go through the NEPA process, and it's a huge effort on the public's part too. And built into it are opportunities for public comment, but really I think what underlies Robert's presentation too is the patience and diligence with which you have to approach it, and that really comes from both sides of the ledger. You know, both from the public side, you want to make sure your comments are considered, and from the industry perspective, they want to make sure that they've considered those comments too and not leave themselves open for a challenge down the road, but also they do want to build the safest pipeline they can build. If they don't, then they're going to they have an accident, and it's going to result in fines and other implications and other legal ramifications that they don't want to deal with. So believe it or not, other than perhaps the public not wanting the pipeline in the first place, the fact that the need and the goal of a safe pipeline is a mutual goal. So I think that I just wanted to preface what we talk about with respect to that. When the Pipeline Safety Trust asked us to speak at this particular conference, our understanding was we were speaking about FERC and the interstate natural gas pipeline construction process in the intersection with PHMSA. I'm not sure that goes exactly to the questions that Carl raised at the outset, but I think a better understanding of that process gets you to the point where you can have that conversation. And I think ultimately, you know, that's a much longer, more expensive conversation. And obviously we have an empty seat at our panel, as we talked about before, without FERC here. So I will do my best to try to give people a sense of the understanding of the FERC process, where the public input comes in, and then also sort of overlay that with where PHMSA comes in and has come in on construction issues. I think lastly, and people have touched on this topic too, obviously a market difference between natural gas and oil. Natural gas coming through the FERC process is a pretty, it's a managed process. It may be long and it may be confusing, but it is fairly well established. On the oil side, you know, it's a little bit more piecemeal because you go state by state through the issues. If we have time to talk about some of the oil issues, we can, but the focus of this is going to be on the natural gas side. I think really Alan already touched on this, but truthfully, we're in a very different world than we were 10 years ago. when it comes to natural gas pipelines and really pipelines in general, oil and gas. So I think I won't go through the details on the slide because you've probably heard them over the last 2 days, but the point being that we are seeing a greater need for more infrastructure, and the question really to this group and to industry is how are we going to do that in a way that's safe and that has the least impact to the environment, et cetera. So that is the focus. To speak a little bit about the regulatory authority, and you've heard some of this and most of you are probably familiar with this, but FERC on the one hand really governs the application process for the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. That requires going through a number of steps, NEPA being primary, but siting and routing is all part of that process. And then I really should have put parentheses around the rates. They also are responsible for that, but obviously the focus of the NEPA process and the application process is driven by different considerations than the rates. On the PHMSA side of the ledger, their mission is to as Alan said, regulate the safe operation of pipelines. And how do they do that? They have regulations, Part 192, Part 195, but Part 192 for natural gas that regulate the design, construction standards, materials, depending on what type of pipeline you're building, installation issues, welding, all kinds of things are caught up in that construction design portion. And then also, of course, how they're going to be operated, how are they going to be maintained, how are they going to be inspected, what kind of plans do you have to have in place for public awareness, for operator qualification, many of the things that Alan mentioned. Where do they intersect? Construction. They come at it from different angles. And that's sort of the crux of what we're talking about today. But from the FERC angle, they want to make sure when construction takes place, you're following your manual, you're following the guidelines they put in place, that you are following any conditions that have been put in place. From PHMSA's perspective, they're enforcing their safety standards in that construction process, whether it's in your manual or how it is you're doing the construction. And we'll talk a little bit later about what PHMSA is actually doing in terms of construction inspections, because I think you all would be surprised to know they're doing a lot more than maybe you think. So, FERC Authority. Section 7, Natural Gas Act, gives them the authority to review applications for construction of interstate natural gas pipelines. What I should have done on here was a timeline for you all of kind of what the process is. So I'm just going to talk about that verbally. I used all my creative juices on that Venn diagram, which I was really pleased that I could create myself. I don't know that I could actually do a timeline, but I can talk about one. So the certification process itself, it can start in two ways. I think in Robert's case that he talked about, it started with the pre-filing application, and most of the time these days that's what most applicants choose to do. And the process involved with the pre-filings, they file their pre-filing request with the agency. The agency issues a notice of intent, FERC, that says either we're going to do an EA for smaller projects or we're going to do an EIS for larger projects. I'll talk about the EIS process separately, but I just kind of want to tick through how the timing works. When they do that, they have to do scoping meetings, and there's lots of opportunity for public comment. They pick places along the pipeline route, the proposed route, the initial proposed route, I should say, for having these different public meetings, and they're required to issue the notices for the meetings so that they're as widely distributed as they can be. And that is sort of the first opportunity for input on. Usually, initially, it's on the routing, but that's where the questions really begin about the routing, about what kind of compression stations are going to be along the line, where are those going to be, what kind of air quality issues should we be thinking about. It's all types of issues. So when they go through all that process of the scoping and they're gathering public input and public comment at the same time, the same applicants have already typically or are issuing letters to landowners along that route to talk to them about coming out to survey. The goal of the survey process is multiple. One, it's to survey the properties for geologic issues, cultural resource issues, any archaeological issues, environmental issues, all types of things. And they're gathering all that information at the same time they're having all these public meetings. And the result of that, ultimately, is to put together an application. And part of that application, one part goes to the routing process, one part goes to the environmental report. So there are 2 big submittals that are part of that application. So that year or 8 months roughly, leading from the moment they file they start the pre-filing process to when an application is filed, there's a lot of conversations going on, not just with the public, but also between the applicant, other agencies they're going to have to speak to about all these different issues. So there's a lot going on during that time of gathering information and a lot of opportunity for public comment during that time frame. So once they've done once they conclude that process, they file their application. At that point, FERC issues a notice of the application, and if there was no pre-filing, that's when scoping begins. If there was pre-filing, that's the time period within which FERC starts to heavily review all this information that's been submitted. So typically, I think, as I said, most of these days, mostly you're going to see pre-filing. So the process is a little more, I think, a little smoother from the public perspective because there's more time to look at everything. Once they've reviewed the application, they will issue a draft of either an EA, an environmental assessment, or the EIS. And that goes out for public comment as well. Robert spoke about this. That's when they also submitted comments at a separate juncture. That is the time, if you feel like they haven't captured your comments before, it's important to comment at that point because that comment period, the end of that comment period is when FERC will actually issue a decision whether to proceed or not to proceed. So you want to make sure that your comments are considered at that point and get them into the agency at that point. So that's sort of it's a 6-step process, basically. Pre-filing, application, notice of application, review of application, draft EIS or EA, and then the FERC decision. Go to the next slide. So the role of NEPA, which underlies really all of this process. NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, and it requires federal agencies to prepare environmental impact statements for major projects. So really that's going to, from the pipeline perspective, it's going to be new pipelines that require a lot of new right-of-way. If it is either a smaller pipeline project that's maybe connecting to existing pipelines, or it is putting a pipeline alongside another pipeline that the company already has, like the Transco project, that may be an EA. But an EA can result in an EIS, depending on the agency's decision at the end of the day. So you may end up with both as an applicant. But at the beginning, they make a decision which one it's going to be. So if the EIS results in a finding of significant impact, then you're going to end up with an EIS also. The purpose of the EIS, I mean, it looks so simple on a slide, but it results in so many different considerations. Certainly on the environmental side, you're looking at soil impacts, you're looking at impacts to wetlands and water bodies, you're looking to impacts to forested areas, forested wetlands, you're looking at impacts to any public lands or conservation lands, you're looking at noise quality, you're looking at endangered species issues. You're looking at, as I said before, the cultural issues, archaeological issues. You're also looking at socioeconomic impacts, whether it's good for these communities, in what way is it not good for these communities, any impacts on environmental justice communities. So the number of factors are quite extensive. And during all that time, these other agencies are also involved. So these companies have to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service on any endangered species issues and consult with them to make sure that they've identified everything. If there are issues, how are they going to handle that? What kind of plans are they going to have in place? Migratory bird issues, for instance, come under that rubric. They have to talk to the Corps about wetlands permitting to the extent they're going to need any, and what that's going to look like. They have to talk to EPA. EPA has veto authority on the 404 permits from the Corps. Plus, they're going to comment on whatever state permits you have to get issued for the Clean Air Act, for any number of issues. So there's a lot of talking going on with all of these different agencies, and many of them are participating agencies, just like PHMSA. So they're going to be sending in comments too, and they all have a different mission and a different goal in mind. But they're usually they submit comments to the FERC docket, and I should have mentioned at the outset that anyone can go on to FERC and request to be provided information that gets loaded on the FERC docket. Anyone can look at the FERC docket, but you can also get push notifications so that you know when things are filed. So you can see all the comments people have been commenting. That part's very transparent. FERC is the lead agency for purposes of NEPA. That means they coordinate all of the comments from everybody, whether it's the public or all the other participating agencies.